A Room Without a View, written and read by Christopher Halton. In the 1930s, a journey from the West Country to Norfolk was no trifling matter. The principal roads, though surfaced with tarmac or tar-bound macadam, were narrow affairs that wound their way through market towns and villages, demanding both patience and endurance from the traveller. Beyond these lay the lesser byroads, often little more than stretches of compacted stone, where the progress of a motor car became a slow and jolting business, over mile after mile of indifferent surface. Had it not been for an important meeting with an agricultural engineering client, I should have much preferred to conduct the matter by telephone and spare myself the roads altogether. But here I am digressing. Mile after mile of rough going soon convinced me that the journey might stretch to 14 hours or more, and plainly the strain of the road had taken an undue toll upon the engine of my car. Near the village of Westerham, on the Essex and Suffolk border, the machine began to overheat and lose steam, coughing and spluttering as though in the throes of death itself. It was on a dark country byroad, while coaxing the failing vehicle along, that I came upon the Westerham boarding house. The house stood somewhat apart from the rest of the settlement, surrounded by a small clump of elder trees near the lane, and set at some distance from the nearest dwellings. As the hour was late, after an early start at 5 that morning, I was grateful to discover a place that offered the prospect of a few hours' sleep, and perhaps a local mechanic who might attend to my car's failing health. Parking my motor car beside a hand-painted Rooms to Let sign, I walked cautiously to the door of the large brick-built house and pressed the bell. After a minute or two, I heard the sound of shuffling feet within, and the heavy black Victorian front door opened slowly with a long creak. When the hall light was switched on, I found myself confronted by a middle-aged, rather stout woman in a white dressing gown, her hair hastily pinned back with a collection of hairpins. She regarded me in silence for a moment, as though I had roused her from a sound sleep. Realizing the late hour, I said at once, "I am very sorry to trouble you, madam, but I saw your sign, and I'm in need of somewhere to sleep for a few hours." She looked me over, taking in, I suspect, my business suit, and her manner softened a little. "If you have a case, please follow me," she said quietly, "but do be careful. I have other guests who would not care to be disturbed." The hall itself was plainly furnished, containing little more than a narrow table for letters, a rack of walking sticks, and a wooden stand where several pairs of muddy boots had been left to dry. After retrieving my suitcase from the car, I followed her up a flight of creaking wooden stairs to the first floor. There she unlocked a door and ushered me into a small single bedroom containing a narrow bed and a washstand with the customary jug and bowl. "This is all I have available," she said. 2 shillings with breakfast in the morning and the option for lunch and dinner. I thanked her, and after handing me the key, she retired once more to her own room. Having unpacked the few necessities for the morning, including a fresh studded shirt collar, which I placed upon the small wooden dressing table, I undressed and clambered into bed. As I settled myself in the unfamiliar bed, I had the curious impression that the house possessed a stillness deeper than mere silence. But regardless of any impressions, as it was mid-July, the night was warm, and so I left the sash window slightly ajar. Having enjoyed a sound sleep, I rose early and had a good wash and shave. The water was somewhat cooler than I should have liked, but it served well enough to sharpen the senses, and before long I was dressed and made my way downstairs to the dining room, where 3 other guests were already assembled for breakfast. After bidding everyone a cheerful good morning, I took my seat and set about a hearty English breakfast, which I washed down with a cup of Earl Grey tea. My companions, who proved not especially talkative, consisted of a Mrs. Masters, who, being a friend of the owner, Mrs. Markham, appeared to be something of a permanent resident. Then there was Captain Gregson, who informed me he was holidaying in the locality, and finally a travelling salesman from Yorkshire, Mr. Pettigrew, Yet I noticed there was another place laid at the table which remained conspicuously empty. Curiosity eventually prompted me to inquire who it was intended for. Mrs. Masters glanced briefly toward the vacant setting before replying, rather matter-of-factly, "Oh, that would be the gentleman in room 2. One rarely sees him." "Indeed," I said. "Yes," she added with a faint shrug. "He keeps very much to himself." I found this somewhat curious, though of course there are those who prefer their own company, and it is not uncommon for such people to take their meals privately or to avoid breakfast altogether. Nevertheless, I could not help noticing that the place had been laid with the same care as the rest of the table, and yet none of the others appeared to expect that it would actually be used. Leaving this small curiosity behind, I asked the owner, Mrs. Markham, whether I might telephone Norfolk and also inquire after a local mechanic. Having first telephoned my client in Norfolk to explain the unavoidable delay, Mrs. Markham provided me with the number for Pomeroy's garage in the village. I was fortunate enough to speak with Mr. Pomeroy himself, who assured me that he would attend to the car later that day. My business concluded for the moment, I took a brief walk outside, though not venturing too far from the house, lest Mr. Pomeroy should arrive in my absence. It was during this short excursion that I happened to notice the bedroom window belonging to room 2. The shutters were firmly closed, giving the appearance that the room was unoccupied. This struck me as somewhat odd, for the morning had turned warm and bright, and all the other windows of the house stood open, their curtains drawn back and the sashes raised to admit both light and air. Only the window of room 2 remained tightly shuttered. Whoever lived in that room seemed to shun life itself. I even returned briefly to the house and stood quietly upon the landing, listening at the door of room 2, convinced the chamber must in fact be unused. To my surprise, however, I distinctly heard movement from within. I could not linger long enough to investigate further, for the landing soon became busy with other guests passing to and fro, and I thought it prudent to withdraw rather than attract attention. Later that morning, as promised, Mr. Pomeroy arrived and quickly diagnosed the difficulty. The water pump, it seemed, had failed entirely and would require replacement. Unfortunately, the part would have to be ordered, so the repair would take at least 2 days. Mr. Pomeroy suggested that the car remain where it stood, and that he would attend to the repair there once the part arrived. Thus it appeared that I should be obliged to spend at least 2 further nights at the boarding house, and I informed Mrs. Markham of my intention to remain. As at breakfast, the place for the occupant of room 2 was laid at the table, though the guest himself did not appear, nor indeed did he attend luncheon or dinner. None of the other guests seemed remotely concerned by this circumstance, and I began to suspect that, being so far from home and somewhat fatigued from travel, I might be attaching undue significance to what likely had some perfectly ordinary explanation. As my room stood directly opposite room 2, I resolved that evening to observe the door for any sign of activity. The keyhole afforded a narrow but sufficient view of the landing. At about 9 o'clock that night, I heard heavy footsteps ascending the staircase and stopping outside the door of room 2. Looking through the keyhole, I saw Mrs. Markham standing there, dressed in a white apron and wearing brown rubber gloves. In her hands she carried what appeared to be a full galvanized metal bucket. She unlocked the door and entered the room. A moment later, I heard a curious sound from within, something between a sucking and a gulping noise, which continued for perhaps a minute or 2. When she emerged again, the front of her apron appeared dark and wet, and in the dim light it looked disturbingly like blood, such as one might see upon the apron of a butcher. She paused on the landing and glanced carefully in both directions before locking the door behind her. At that very moment, something within the room struck violently against the door, as though thrashing in agitation. For a moment I had the strange impression that whatever was inside the room had become aware of my presence on the landing. Mrs. Markham startled slightly at the noise, then hurried down the staircase without another glance behind her. I quickly realized that any direct questioning of Mrs. Markham regarding the events I had witnessed would likely achieve very little. Instead, I resolved to wait for the opportunity to raise the subject of room 2 more discreetly, and thought that Mrs. Masters, being a long-term resident, might prove more forthcoming if approached gently during a meal. Sure enough, the following morning the place at the table for the occupant of room 2 was once again laid for breakfast. Present were Mrs. Masters and Captain Gregson, though Mr. Pettigrew had apparently departed the previous day. I first struck up a conversation with the captain, a monocled gentleman with a neat military moustache. Though well into his 60s, he carried himself with the erect bearing of a man long accustomed to command. He informed me that he had served for many years in an Indian Light Cavalry regiment in British India. The captain warmed readily to the subject, and we spoke at some length about his experiences there, which soon attracted the attention of Mrs. Masters. During the conversation, I made a curious discovery. Both Mrs. Masters and Mrs. Markham had once been married to servicemen who had also served in India. Indeed, Mrs. Markham's late husband had held the rank of colonel, while Mrs. Masters' husband had served as a lieutenant in the very same regiment as Captain Gregson. In this respect, I found myself something of an outsider to the conversation, for I had never yet travelled to that part of the world. I asked what had happened to the late colonel, but Mrs. Masters did not respond to my question, and instead picked up another thread of the conversation with the captain. Naturally, this aroused a suspicion that something was odd, and I think that Gregson picked up on that too. Suffice to say, Mrs. Masters declined to stay longer, made her excuses, and left. Captain Gregson then invited me to go for a morning stroll and a chat, as the weather was again a fine sunny day. I guessed he had something about the place to share with me, and thought this a good time to share my observations from the previous night. We wandered down into the nearby village, where we found a small cafe and took a table outside beneath a canvas awning. Presently a pot of Darjeeling tea was brought to us, and as Captain Gregson poured 2 cups, he leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "Well, dear boy, I suspect we have rather more to discuss about Mrs. Markham's boarding house than one might expect. I arrived a few days before you, and I too have observed, shall we say, a few anomalies." I smiled faintly as I added milk to the cups. "Would that be room 2? "By Jove!" he exclaimed, visibly startled. "The very room." I took a sip of tea before replying. "Then perhaps you might tell me what you believe lies behind that door." Gregson paused for a moment before answering. "Before we come to that, you must understand that I knew something of the Markhams during my time in India. Markham commanded a regiment stationed in the north during a rather unpleasant local uprising. Intelligence reached him that the trouble centred upon a particular village and upon a fakir who was believed to be stirring the natives against the authorities." Gregson lowered his voice slightly. "Markham led a detachment there himself. Matters became heated, and in the confusion the colonel struck the fakir down with his sword while still mounted. The man fell badly wounded." He stirred his tea slowly before continuing. "As the fakir lay dying in the dust, he raised himself upon one elbow and pointed directly at Markham. Those present later swore that he pronounced a curse upon him. He said that the colonel possessed a thirst for blood, and that such a man should become the very creature his nature revealed him to be." Gregson paused before continuing. "And with that, the fakir died, along with a number of villagers whom Markham claimed had taken part in the insurrection. A few weeks later, the colonel resigned his commission on the grounds of ill health, and he and his wife returned to England. I assume the Masters followed them at about the same time. That must be 30 years ago now." I then recounted my own experience of the previous evening, how I had seen Mrs. Markham enter room 2 carrying a bucket, and how she had emerged shortly afterwards with her apron stained a dark and troubling red. Gregson listened in silence. When I finished, he looked so startled that his monocle slipped from his eye and fell against his waistcoat. He caught it quickly and replaced it, though his expression had grown noticeably grave. "This fellow Pettigrew," he said at length. "Yes," I replied. "What about him?" "He checked out yesterday, did he not?" "So Mrs. Markham told us." Gregson leaned forward slightly. 2 hours after breakfast, I happened to pass the rear yard, and his motor car was still standing where he had left it. Yet, when I looked again later in the afternoon, it had vanished. "And yet," Gregson added thoughtfully, "I do not recall hearing any motor leave the yard that morning." I frowned. "Perhaps he returned for it." Gregson shook his head slowly. "Perhaps," he said. "But now that you speak of this bloodied bucket, I cannot help wondering whether the two matters might be connected." I confess the thought sent a cold shudder through me. We agreed to speak no further of the matter until after dinner, when Captain Gregson would join me in my room. Our intention was simple enough. If Mrs. Markham again entered room 2, we would confront her. Accordingly, we kept watch from my room, taking turns to observe the corridor through the keyhole. After some time, Gregson whispered suddenly, "She has just gone in." We slipped quietly into the corridor and waited beside the door of room 2. Within moments, we again heard those dreadful sounds from inside the room, an ugly sucking and slurping noise that turned my stomach. Then Mrs. Markham's voice reached us clearly through the door. "Now, dear," she said gently, "eat more slowly. I do not want you to be sick." The words made me feel faint with revulsion, and I was certain I could smell the metallic tang of blood in the air. After several minutes, the noises subsided. The door opened and Mrs. Markham stepped into the corridor, only to stop short when she saw Gregson and myself standing there. She was wearing rubber gloves and a white apron stained dark with blood, though not quite so heavily as on the previous evening. Without a word, Gregson pushed past her and opened the door fully. I followed close behind and switched on the electric light. What I saw in that room will remain with me for the rest of my life. Upon a narrow iron bed lay a figure that might once have been a man. The face was horribly decayed, the flesh about the mouth rotted away so that a set of long yellow teeth was permanently exposed in a dreadful grin. The nose had largely collapsed, revealing the dark cavities beneath, while the eyes, red and raw, stared wildly from sockets that possessed no eyelids to shield them. At the sudden glare of the light, the creature gave a shriek so terrible that it froze the blood in my veins. It writhed violently upon the bed, but its movements were restricted by heavy chains that bound its limbs firmly to the metal frame. The creature thrashed and clawed at the air, twisting in obvious agony, as though the light itself caused it pain. Mrs. Markham raised her hands imploringly. "Please," she said, her voice trembling, "turn off the light, and I will tell you everything you wish to know." I hesitated only a moment before nodding to Gregson. He reached past me and extinguished the light, and we all stepped back into the corridor. Once outside, Mrs. Markham removed her rubber gloves and let them fall to the floor. She drew a long breath and said quietly, "You had better tell him, dear." I turned in surprise, unsure to whom she was speaking, until I felt the unmistakable pressure of a handgun barrel press firmly into the small of my back. It was Gregson. His voice, when he spoke, sounded oddly younger than I remembered. "My God, Captain," I said, scarcely able to believe it. "What has possessed you?" The voice behind me replied calmly, "It is Colonel to you." There was a pause before he added, almost conversationally, "Colonel Markham." The truth struck me like a blow. "So who," I asked slowly, "is in that room?" Mrs. Markham answered without hesitation. "Our son Jonathan was the subject of the fakir's curse. We have kept him safely here for many years, and we intend to continue doing so." Colonel Markham then ordered me down the staircase and into the kitchen. There I found Mrs. Masters standing at the range, calmly frying something in a large oval pan. She turned, smiled at the Colonel and said, "Another one for the topping shed." "Yes," Markham replied. "And how unfortunate. I was just becoming rather fond of his company. But Jonathan must eat tonight. All we have left are Pettigrew's legs." What struck me most was not merely the horror of their words, but the casual manner in which they discussed murder and cannibalism, as though it were nothing more than the preparation of an ordinary household meal. I had no intention of becoming another victim of their dreadful arrangement. At that moment, fortune intervened. Mr. Pomeroy and his assistant suddenly entered the kitchen from the hallway, carrying the replacement pump for my motor car. Their unexpected arrival plainly caught the others off guard. Briefly, no one moved. I realized instantly that if Colonel Markham were to shoot them as well as myself, it would be impossible to conceal such a crime. Taking the risk that he understood this as clearly as I did, I turned to Mr. Pomeroy and said as calmly as I could, "Let me unlock the car for you." Without waiting for permission, I walked briskly from the kitchen and out through the front door. Once outside, I wasted no time in urging Pomeroy to drive me at once to the nearest police station, where I gave a full account of everything I had witnessed. After some persuasion, a sergeant and a constable agreed to accompany me back to the boarding house, both armed with revolvers. But when we returned, we found the house already ablaze. Flames were pouring from every window, and the heat was so intense that the officers were unable to enter despite several attempts. By morning, little remained of the Westram boarding house but charred beams and smoking rubble. The authorities later conducted a thorough search of the ruins. Among the debris, they discovered the bodies of Colonel Markham, his wife, and Mrs. Masters. Each had been shot through the head with a revolver. But of the creature that had been chained in the bedroom, there was no trace whatsoever. The end. I have now released 3 new books containing my short stories on Amazon. You can find me there by typing in Christopher Halton.